It is 3 in the morning. The fire has burned down to a bed of glowing coals. Still warm, still producing a faint orange light, but not the aggressive, crackling blaze of the early evening. The group is asleep. All 23 of them, including the children, including the elderly woman who has seen more winters than anyone else in the community, including the 2 best hunters whose spears are lying within arm's reach, but whose hands are currently doing nothing more threatening than being slightly open beside their sleeping bodies. 40 meters away at the edge of the tree line, a cave lion is standing very still. It is a large animal, 250 kilograms of apex predator with sensory capabilities that make the darkness around the sleeping camp as navigable as daylight is to the humans inside it. It can hear the breathing of 23 sleeping people. It can smell them. The specific combination of human scent, food residue, fire smoke, and the animal hides that serve as bedding and clothing. It has been watching this camp for some time. By any naive assessment of the situation, it is looking at the easiest meal it will ever have the opportunity to take. And it is not moving. Not because it is afraid in the way that a prey animal is afraid, not because it has calculated the risk and decided against it in the way that a rational agent would, but because something about this specific configuration of stimuli, the fire, even reduced to coals, the smell of humans in concentrations that indicate a group rather than an individual, the specific sounds of a camp rather than isolated prey, is triggering aversion responses that the animal's nervous system has built up through a combination of direct experience and whatever behavioral transmission exists in its species. The cave lion eventually turns and moves back into the forest. The sleeping humans never knew it was there. This is the scenario that the title promises to explain. And the explanation involves fire, social architecture, sensory ecology, the evolutionary dynamics of predator-prey relationships, and something deeply fascinating about how ancient humans transformed themselves from vulnerable prey animals into something that the most dangerous predators in the ancient world learned to actively avoid. First, let's be honest about the framing in the title, because intellectual honesty is always more interesting than a clean narrative. Predators did attack sleeping ancient humans. This happened. The evidence for predation on ancient humans by large carnivores is present in the fossil record. Leopard tooth marks on ancient hominin skulls, eagle talon punctures on cranial remains, the specific bone accumulation patterns at sites that document ancient hominin remains being brought to carnivore dens as prey. For millions of years of hominin history, large carnivores were a regular and significant mortality source. The more accurate version of the question is, why did predation on sleeping ancient humans become increasingly rare over the course of ancient human history, to the point where the overnight camp of a modern hunter-gatherer community is effectively safe from large predator attack in most circumstances? What changed? What did ancient humans develop that converted the sleeping group from a collection of vulnerable, unconscious prey animals into something that large predators in most circumstances chose to avoid rather than engage? Because that change is real, and it is one of the most important behavioral and technological achievements in the entire span of ancient human development. The answer is worth understanding in detail. Let's start with fire, because fire is the foundation of everything else, and its role in ancient predator deterrence is more sophisticated than simply fire scares animals. The relationship between large predators and fire is not a learned aversion in most species. It appears to be largely innate, a deeply embedded response to stimuli that, across millions of years of evolutionary history, has been reliably associated with danger. Wildfire is a genuine and serious threat to large mammals. It moves unpredictably, it cuts off escape routes, it produces toxic gases, and it kills efficiently. A mammalian nervous system that generates strong avoidance responses to fire-associated stimuli, the smell of smoke, the visual cue of flame, the heat associated with burning, is a nervous system that survives wildfires. One that does not generate these responses does not survive. This evolutionary logic has produced what is essentially a hardwired aversion to open flame in most large land predators. Cave lions, cave bears, leopards, wolves, hyenas, The major predators of the ancient human world showed strong avoidance of open fire regardless of whether they had personally experienced fire as dangerous. The response was not learned from individual experience. It was built into their nervous systems by millions of years of selection. This is not just ancient campfire folklore. Modern wildlife research has confirmed that large predators in wilderness areas show consistent, strong avoidance of open flame and significant avoidance of fire-associated smells, even in contexts where they have no personal experience of fire as dangerous. The aversion is robust, it is cross-species, and it is sufficiently reliable that it would have functioned as effective predator deterrence in ancient human camps, regardless of whether any specific predator had previously encountered humans or their fire. But fire's deterrent effect is not unlimited or unconditional. A fire that has burned completely out provides no deterrent. A fire that is very small provides limited deterrent. A fire in a landscape where prey is scarce enough and hunger severe enough can be overcome by a sufficiently motivated predator. Fire was the foundation of ancient predator deterrence, but it worked best as part of a system, not as a standalone solution. Let's talk about fire management, because the effectiveness of fire as a predator deterrent depended on active, skilled management across the entire sleeping period. An ancient community's fire did not manage itself. The challenge of maintaining a fire through the night, when temperatures dropped, when wind conditions changed, when the wood supply required replenishment, was an ongoing task that required active human participation. Ancient communities in contexts with significant predator pressure almost certainly maintained firewatch practices. Dedicated individuals awake and attending to the fire at any given time during the night, with responsibility for keeping the fire at an effective level and for monitoring the surrounding environment for signs of predator activity. The evidence for ancient firewatch practices is indirect. Behaviors don't fossilize directly, but the logic is compelling and consistent with what is documented in traditional communities. The specific anthropological research by David Sampson on sleep patterns in contemporary Hadza communities found that within any given night, the distribution of sleep stages across different community members was rarely simultaneously deep. At most times during the night, at least some community members were in lighter sleep stages, more alert, more responsive to environmental stimuli, more likely to notice and respond to unusual sounds or smells. This distributed vigilance was not assigned or scheduled. It was a natural consequence of individual variation in sleep timing and sleep architecture within a group. But its effect was similar to a scheduled watch system. The sleeping camp was never entirely unmonitored, never simultaneously in the deepest and most unresponsive sleep stages across all of its members. A predator approaching the camp was approaching a group that at any moment might have one or several individuals in states of sufficient alertness to detect the approach and raise an alarm. The firewatch function, the deliberate maintenance of someone awake and alert during sleeping periods, almost certainly overlaid this natural distributed vigilance with an explicit layer of intentional monitoring in ancient communities that faced significant predator pressure. The combination produced a sleeping group that was more reliably monitored than its apparently unconscious state would suggest. Let's talk about site selection, because where ancient humans chose to sleep was one of the most important predator deterrence decisions they made on a daily basis. Predator attack requires approach. Approach requires either concealment, cover that allows a predator to get close before the prey detects the threat, or speed sufficient to close the distance before the prey can respond effectively. Ancient human campsite selection in predator-rich environments specifically targeted locations that minimized both of these options. Elevated positions, hillsides, raised ground, cliff faces with the sleeping group positioned against the rock, reduce the number of approach directions available to a predator, and provide sight lines that make concealed approach more difficult. Multiple ethnographic accounts of traditional hunter-gatherer campsite selection in predator-rich environments document the consistent preference for elevated, defensible positions with good visibility in multiple directions. Dense vegetation near the sleeping area is consistently avoided in traditional communities with predator awareness, because dense vegetation provides the concealment that ambush predators require for approach. The clearing of vegetation around ancient campsites, not for any reason the community would have articulated as predator deterrence, but as a consequence of the ongoing human activity of camp use, produced the open surroundings that made concealed approach more difficult. Water proximity presents a specific challenge. Water sources are essential for human needs, but they are also the preferred hunting zones of many large predators, who know that prey animals must visit water regularly. Ancient communities in predator-rich environments managed this trade-off by not camping directly at water sources, accessing water during daylight hours when visibility was good and the group was alert, and camping at a distance from the water's edge where the predator density was lower. The acoustic environment of the campsite mattered as well. Sites where wind conditions would carry the camp's scent toward rather than away from the likely approach directions of predators were specifically less desirable. Ancient communities with detailed knowledge of local wind patterns would have incorporated this consideration into campsite selection, choosing positions where the prevailing airflow carried their smell and the smell of their fire outward in ways that gave maximum early warning of their presence rather than maximum concealment. Now let's talk about the landscape of fear, because this ecological concept is essential for understanding why large predators increasingly avoided ancient human camps over the course of ancient human history. The landscape of fear is a concept in behavioral ecology describing the way that prey animals modify their behavior and spatial use in response to perceived predation risk. But it applies in reverse as well. Predators develop their own landscape of fear in response to the risks that specific prey types or environmental features present to them. Predators are not simply risk-free killers. Every predation attempt carries injury risk. A large prey animal can kick, gore, or crush a predator during the kill attempt. A prey animal that is part of a defensive group can organize collective responses that injure the attacking predator. And an injured predator, one that has a broken rib, a damaged eye, a wounded leg, is a predator that cannot hunt effectively, which means starvation risk. The evolutionary logic of predator behavior strongly selects for risk aversion. Predators take the safest available prey option, not the most dramatic one. Ancient humans were not safe prey options. They were organized, armed, fire-maintaining, collectively vigilant social groups that responded to predator presence with noise, fire-feeding, projectile throwing, and collective advance rather than panicked scatter. A predator that had previously encountered an ancient human camp under these conditions had received strong aversive conditioning. The experience of approaching what looked like vulnerable sleeping prey and encountering something entirely different. And here's the specific mechanism through which the landscape of fear operated on predator behavior. Repeated negative encounters with ancient human groups did not just affect the individual predators involved. The behavioral patterns of predators are transmitted within species through a combination of direct learning by young animals accompanying adults, and the simple fact that individual predators with negative encounter histories survive and reproduce, while those that repeatedly engage with the most dangerous prey options do not. Over generations, predator populations in regions with significant ancient human presence would have developed population-level behavioral avoidance of human camps that went beyond individual learning. Let's talk about the specific sensory countermeasures that ancient humans employed, because fire and site selection were not the only tools in the ancient predator deterrence toolkit. Sound is one of the most important predator deterrence mechanisms available to ancient humans. Large predators are stealth hunters. Their hunting strategy depends on approach without alerting the prey. On closing the distance before the prey's alarm response can organize an effective escape or defense. The continuous production of sound by an ancient camp. The ambient sounds of a sleeping group, snoring, shifting, occasional murmurs, and the specific sounds of fire management. The crackle of burning wood, the sound of someone adding fuel, disrupts the silence that stealth approach requires, and communicates to approaching predators that the camp is awake and aware to a degree that makes concealed approach impossible. Dogs, or more precisely, the proto-dogs, the semi-domesticated wolves that ancient humans had begun their relationship with by approximately 15,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier, added a crucial sensory extension to the ancient camp's alarm system. Canid sensory capabilities particularly olfactory sensitivity and the auditory range, exceed human sensory capabilities substantially, and a sleeping camp with a semi-domesticated canid presence had effective sensory monitoring in the radial detection range of the animal's nose and ears, even when no human was in a sufficiently light sleep stage to notice an approaching predator. The alarm barking of a dog detecting predator approach activates the entire camp within seconds. It is one of the most effective early warning systems available in a natural environment, and the ancient humans who first began their mutualistic relationship with dogs almost certainly discovered this benefit quickly. A camp with dogs was a dramatically safer sleeping environment than a camp without them. Not because the dogs could physically deter a large predator in most cases, but because they could detect the predator's approach and generate the alarm that converted the sleeping group from apparently vulnerable prey to alert, armed, coordinated defenders before the predator could close to attacking distance. Let's talk about the collective defense dimension, because this is what converted ancient humans from prey to something considerably more complicated for predators to engage with. A sleeping group that wakes to a predator alarm does not behave like individual prey animals. It behaves like a coordinated social unit. This is the specific feature of ancient human responses to predator threat that most comprehensively changed the predator-prey calculation. Individual prey animals, a single impala, a lone wildebeest, respond to predator detection with flight. Flight is the optimal individual response when the predator is fast enough to catch you if you stay. And the cost of the encounter to the predator if you stand and fight is insufficient to deter the attack. For most prey animals, collective defense is limited to herding behavior, the confusion of many individuals in motion making target selection difficult for the predator. Ancient human groups responded differently. They did not scatter. They converged. An alarm that woke an ancient sleeping camp produced a response where the adults of the group moved toward the threat together, producing fire, producing noise, potentially producing projectiles, and presenting the predator with a coordinated group advance rather than fleeing individuals. This collective response was the specific anti-predator behavior of a highly social, cognitively sophisticated, fire-maintaining, weapons-possessing species. And it was essentially unprecedented in the ancient predator's experience. The specific cognitive demands of this collective defense response were substantial. It required that every adult in the group understand their role in the response, that the response be coordinated rapidly and effectively even in conditions of disorientation from awakening, and that the group maintain collective coherence under the specific psychological pressure of a large predator at close range. These demands were met because the response had been practiced, discussed, and culturally transmitted within the community. Everyone knew what to do because it had been talked about, rehearsed in low-stakes contexts, and drawn on the accumulated experience of previous encounters. Let's talk about ancient humans' active management of the predator landscape over time, because this is the dimension of the story that most directly explains why predation on sleeping ancient humans became progressively rarer rather than staying constant. Ancient humans did not passively accept the predator landscape they inhabited. They managed it. Not through any systematic conservation or wildlife management program, those concepts are modern, but through the accumulated effect of consistent, organized, effective responses to predator presence that, over time, changed predator behavior in human-occupied territories. A predator population that repeatedly encounters organized, fire-wielding, collectively defensive human groups learns, through the specific mechanisms of individual experience, behavioral transmission, and population-level selection, that human camps are not viable targets. The most dangerous individuals among a predator population are those most willing to engage with the most challenging prey. If those individuals consistently have worse outcomes, injury, failure, death, than those that avoid human-occupied territories, the population shifts over generations toward avoidance behavior. This is not a rapid process, and it is not universal. There are documented cases in historical periods of individual large predators that overcame their species' general aversion to humans and became habitual human hunters. But the general direction of the process, operating across thousands of years of ancient human occupation of specific territories, was toward progressive reduction of predation risk from the large carnivores that initially shared those territories. The archaeological evidence is consistent with this directional process. The frequency of predation evidence, carnivore tooth marks on hominin bones, in the fossil record decreases over the span of ancient human evolution, consistent with a progressive reduction in the vulnerability of ancient humans to predation as their behavioral and technological capabilities developed. The specific predators associated with ancient hominin remains in the deepest layers of the fossil record, largely absent from later, more behaviorally modern ancient human sites, tell the same story. As ancient human capabilities increased, their status in the ecological relationship with large predators shifted from prey to competitor to something that the predators increasingly avoided. Let's address the question that the survivalist in the audience is probably asking. What happened when the fire went out completely? Because fires do go out. Fuel runs out, heavy rain can extinguish them. And a camp where the fire has gone completely cold in the deepest part of the night, with no light and no smoke and no crackling sound, is a camp that has lost its primary deterrent. Ancient communities in high predator risk environments almost certainly managed this risk through several mechanisms. The banked fire, the practice of burying live coals in ash to reduce oxygen exposure and slow combustion, maintaining heat and ember life through the night with minimal fuel consumption, was almost certainly part of the ancient fire management repertoire. A properly banked fire can maintain live coals for many hours, requiring only the addition of fuel and the exposure of the coals to relight the fire quickly when needed. The knowledge of how to bank a fire effectively and how to restart it rapidly from preserved coals was survival-critical knowledge in predator-rich environments. The secondary defense provided by site selection, dogs, and distributed vigilance meant that the fire was not the only deterrent. Its temporary failure reduced the system's effectiveness but did not eliminate all protection. A camp with a failed fire, but with dogs, with site selection that minimized concealed approach, and with several adults in light sleep stages providing passive monitoring, was not as vulnerable as a camp with no fire and no other deterrent. And ancient communities with significant predator threat experience almost certainly developed specific practices for fire management during high-risk periods. Maintaining more active fire watch, using more fuel to ensure the fire stayed at effective intensity through the highest-risk nighttime hours, and specifically managing the fire condition during the pre-dawn period when temperatures were lowest and predator activity was historically highest. Here is the full picture. The question of why predators did not routinely attack sleeping ancient humans is not answered by any single factor. It is answered by a system, a layered, mutually reinforcing set of behavioral, technological, ecological, and social solutions that ancient humans developed over the full span of their existence in predator-rich environments. Fire that exploited an innate aversion response built into predator nervous systems over millions of years of wildfire exposure. Campsite selection that minimized concealed approach and maximized early detection. Active fire management through the night that maintained the deterrent effect of fire rather than allowing it to lapse. Distributed vigilance within the sleeping group that ensured no extended period of completely unmonitored unconsciousness. Dogs that extended the perimeter of sensory monitoring into the darkness. Collective defense responses that converted a sleeping camp, on alarm, into something entirely different from the vulnerable prey that a predator approaching in darkness had assessed. And, underlying all of this, the accumulated effect of thousands of years of ancient human presence in specific territories, progressively shaping the behavior of the predator populations that shared those territories through the specific mechanism of consistently costly encounters, training the most dangerous animals in the landscape, generation by generation, to recognize human-occupied spaces as places where the cost-benefit calculation for predation was consistently unfavorable. The cave lion at the edge of the tree line turned and walked away. Not because it was stupid. Not because it lacked the capability to close that distance and take something, but because every sensory input it was receiving from that specific configuration of humans, fire, dogs, and terrain was telling it the same thing. This is not worth it. Something in there is dangerous in ways that open grassland prey is not. It had been taught that. By the accumulated experience of its species with the specific thing that ancient humans had become over hundreds of thousands of years of building the capabilities described above. That is not luck. That is one of the most important technological and behavioral achievements in the entire span of ancient human existence. And the sleeping 23 people, completely unaware of what was watching them from the tree line and what had just decided to leave, were its direct beneficiaries.